I think we are seeing the transformation of warfare right before our eyes. Leaders in China and leaders in Russia are watching. How does the U.S. respond? How does Congress respond? We are moving quite quickly with hypersonics. We are today limited by our ability to conduct rapid testing. Russia and China are both making it crystal clear that they have such capability. The U.S. would take very severe losses. And by that, I mean capital ships on the bottom of the ocean with all the people. There would be loss of aircraft. We would win, but it would be an ugly win.
Runway 4 left, wind 040 at 5, clear for takeoff.
Seat tied, altimeter 0 eyes, we're clear for takeoff, clear for the airspace. Viper check 2.
My program curve was at 354. Turn in, lights on. Next, picture 16, 15,000, target, some of that.
Viper 1 target.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you're over on YouTube. As always, thanks to those who've taken the time to leave a rating or review over on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. As always, if you're getting value out of this, just doing that simple little act helps the podcast out. If you're over here on YouTube, dropping a comment down below what you liked about the episode or what you'd like to see more of. That also helps out as well. My guest today is Captain Gene Moran. He spent a career in the Navy, now teaches, does some advising for defense contractors. We talk everything from strategic to tactical implications of conflicts that are going on across the globe. That's Houthis to the Pacific and everything in between. I think you'll enjoy and glean a little bit from his experience. With that being said, let's jump into the podcast with Captain Moran. Sir, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Honored to have you on here and looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today.
Great to be with you. Me as well.
Well, I think we should just dive right in. A lot of things going on in the world today, and you bring some subject matter expertise into a lot of this. And as I alluded to prior, I'm not a Navy guy, but I think a lot of our listeners are going to be interested in hearing what you have to say. And I would like to kick it off with the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, Houthis. Can you talk to me about some of the tactical and the strategic implications and what's going on? Why are we there? Why is it important? What's happening?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe we could sort of work it backwards from the ongoing operations. What you're seeing is a naval response to the Houthi rebels launching all sorts of attacks at us, drones, ballistic missiles, you name it. I think what we're seeing, at least initially, is a pretty spectacular response from the deployed fleet who happened to be on scene when the bell rang. That's a very positive story. We haven't seen this sort of offensive activity being taken against us, where dozens of incoming threats simultaneously. We trained for these things, but we hadn't seen it in real world application. So it's always reassuring to know that the training does seem to be paying off, and training occurs at multiple levels, as I'm sure much of your audience knows. Individual ship level, then organized group training, and then theater level training, integrated with joint operations. But what we're seeing are the Navy responding successfully to every threat that's come at it. There have been a couple of close calls. The U.S. has gravely had to engage their close-in weapon system. That's an automatic system that only goes off when something is extremely close. So that was a last line of defense. I would say that was a close one. Some of the commercial ships that have taken hits, they just lack the self-defense capability. So at the tactical level, we are responding, and now in recent weeks we saw a little bit more offensive posture by the deployed battle group. The Eisenhower battle group is over there. So integrated strike operations to try to take out the archer, so to speak, in the uncontrolled portions of Yemen. I think it took a little while to figure out what the right sort of targets are, because the Houthis are pretty well embedded with the civilian population. So there's a concern about collateral damage. But we saw successful strikes and then a wait period to do some battle damage assessment and see how did we do. And we see this back and forth taking place. Now, those are tactical and operational sort of actions. But at the strategic level, the Houthis appear to have succeeded at dramatically impacting commercial traffic through the Suez Canal. We're down at 30% of what the typical throughput would be on a given day. And that's billions of dollars of commerce that would typically go through the Suez Canal every day. That's the shortest route. There's a reason that canal exists. It gets you from the Far East to Europe about 10 days faster than going around Africa. So if we're not restoring the commercial activity that was taking place before these attacks started, are we really winning at this? And if you step back even further, one could ask, why is a group like the Houthis even able to implement these sort of tactics? Where does their support come from? I think it's well known and identified that it comes from Iran. It takes money for that to be happening, so there's a flow of funding that's allowing for this sort of behavior. That is a strategic and geopolitical issue that needs to be addressed. Let me pause there because we can take this in any number of directions. Let me see if I'm stimulating a line of questioning.
I'm curious. You look at you look at what the Houthis are able to accomplish with the relatively low cost drone operations. Obviously, they are receiving funding versus what we bring to the fight, and it's multi-billion-dollar warships, million-dollar missiles, etc. And when you alluded to we might be winning tactically, but strategically we're losing. Is this sustainable? How do we win this? How do you get back to normal? The battlefield appears to have changed, and these low-cost, high-volume weapon systems, drones, that are being 3D printed or funneled across seem to be very effective. How do we win that? How do we defeat that?
Yeah, I think we are seeing the transformation of warfare right before our eyes. We saw unmanned aerial vehicles used in the Iraq War. We saw the weaponized UAVs as well. That started as a CIA program, then came out into the open space. We're now seeing that concept as technology advances in uncrewed surface vehicles and uncrewed underwater vehicles. So those are logical progressions, and the military is moving in that direction. Some of those systems are lower cost. I will say that the targeting associated with those systems is not necessarily low cost. And so a group like the Houthis is only getting that sort of quality targeting with extreme help from Iran and perhaps others. I think what we're seeing along with this evolution of warfare is our learning curve as we respond to these situations. The initial feedback from the graybeards, so to speak, and maybe I'm reaching the stage where I am a graybeard, was, hey, we're firing $2 million missiles at $20,000 drones. That doesn't seem like a good trade-off. Well, I think that's the wrong calculus. If you look at a destroyer today, costs between $2 and $3 billion, and it has as many as 300 sailors on board. What are you willing to pay to protect that asset? That's a capital asset with lives on board. $2 million against $3 billion plus the lives. That seems like a pretty good trade-off. That said, a $2 million missile is not the right weapon to be using against a drone. The Navy knows this and has known it for some time and has been making effort to use things like directed energy weapons and microwave technologies, and they're in various states of delivery. The Navy has had laser weapons in Fifth Fleet on board a sort of a demonstration ship for a number of years and was moving forward with it. This sort of learning curve during ongoing operations should accelerate that opportunity. The head of the Naval Surface Forces, Admiral McLean, spoke in January at the annual Naval Surface Warfare Symposium, where he said, hey, we've assessed these systems long enough. Let's get on with it. Now, he doesn't own the acquisition side of the equation, but he was sending a clear message, let's move out. So today we don't have effective and deployed laser and microwave systems that would be in some ways less expensive and a more appropriate form of defense for those sort of weapons.
Obviously, that's the tactical Band-Aid to addressing the threat there. But on the strategic level, again, as you alluded to, they're obviously getting funding from somewhere, and there's an agitator out there. How do you address that at the strategic level?
Well, kind of surprisingly, recently Admiral Brad Cooper, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, who at the time was the Fifth Fleet commander, spoke on 60 Minutes. Nora O'Donnell was one of the early major media network personalities to get to the Red Sea and see what was going on. And Admiral Cooper was pretty candid. He said, we are quite capable of directing action at Iran. We know where the targets are. We know what to do. But that's not a military decision. That's a political decision. And the military takes its orders from civilian leadership. So there is a line of thinking out in the national security glitterati that says we don't want this to become a broader war. I contend that we're already in a broader conflict. You know, we've been present in the Middle East for decades now in varying levels. We have people in most of these countries in some form or fashion. It could be hundreds, in some cases it's thousands. You know, we have a footprint at the Horn of Africa. We have people in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Well, I guess we've pulled out of Afghanistan, but that was a misstatement there. But we've continued to keep people on the ground. Syria. These things have some connection points. What I think we're lacking is what is the real end game? There was a time when oil was the end game, and keeping that economic flow. Now it seems to be a little bit about disruption of narcotics trafficking. The Coast Guard actually has a pretty large presence in the Persian Gulf. Many people don't know that, but they are there specifically to interdict drug trafficking that funds some of this terrorist and third-party activity.
Is there a way to manage all this? Because it seems like the web has cast out across the globe where all these players in some form or fashion are interconnected, or different groups are interconnected, and you're combating the disruption, or you're combating the slow and erosion of the freedoms of the world, from freedom of navigation to, seems like, even the freedoms inside our own territory. And all this is interconnected versus, hey, we're going to one spot, we're going to have a conflict, we're going to have a battle here, but now it just seems to breach out. Is that a fair statement? How do you address this?
Yeah, I see connection points. We'll start with freedom of navigation. That should be a fundamental right of any nation that's participating in the global order, to have the safe transit of goods by the sea. A big reason the U.S. Navy exists and operates globally is to assure that those sea lines of communications remain open, and that commerce can transit. And that's been a maritime theory of the United States for hundreds of years. When we see that disrupted, somebody has to defend it. We periodically run these freedom of navigation operations just to demonstrate that you can't cut off countries from operating freely on the ocean commons. When countries see how we respond to some of these various situations around the world, they are learning from us, and they are likely communicating and coordinating with others. So if you look at what happened on October 7th, where Hamas, engaged Israel and started a confrontation. That didn't just happen. They had resources and they had planning time, and they were getting support from somewhere. To what degree was that an intel failure that more people didn't see that coming? I'm not sure. But now how we are responding to our number one ally in the Middle East, at least that's what we've said, Israel's our number one ally in the Middle East, we don't seem ready to just jump in and do anything they want to do. And now Netanyahu is running a very aggressive war that U.S. policymakers don't agree with the tactics of. Well, people like leaders in China and leaders in Russia are watching. How does the U.S. respond? How does Congress respond? When we get weary of supporting Ukraine, I say we, when Congress stops the flow of funding to support a democracy that's been invaded by a neighbor, that's sending a signal to the world that our resolve may not be what we have said it is. Think about Taiwan. Our stated position by this president is that we will defend Taiwan should China invade aggressively. I now question that because I'm not sure that the American people are behind it. I'm not sure that Congress is behind it. And in part, it's because I don't think people fully understand what would it mean to an American at home. America has always fought its wars abroad, or has attempted to. That's been a strategy, is to fight on the other guy's playing field. We don't want to fight the war here. Well, if we step back from our forward engagement, the likelihood of us fighting a war in a place where we don't want to increases. There are conflicting ideologies and strategic thoughts about what is the correct way to pursue a position on the global stage. I think we've lost sight of what is our position in the world that we want, and the American public are a little detached from what that should be. And so, in my mind, that should be a major discussion point in any presidential election, and we're not even talking about it.
I know this is going to be a hypothetical answer and response here, and a little bit of a what if. But let's say the U.S. military pulls back, specifically the Navy, with freedom of navigation. Said, hey, you know what? This is no longer our prerogative. What do you think the world starts to look like? How fast does it start to change? Because the Navy's pretty involved in making sure there's freedom of navigation. So we just pick apart that aspect.
I use the example of the Barbary pirates hundreds of years ago, where they would extract tribute for ships to make safe passage. The vacuum will be filled with bad actors making similar extractions around the world. There are many straits and choke points that matter strategically. So Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, Suez Canal, just a few examples. Strait of Gibraltar, pretty close to the U.S. actually. These sort of strategic choke points could be cut off and immediately affect commerce, the flow of commerce. People don't often recognize how much commerce moves on the oceans. As we're recording this, there's a recovery effort going on in Baltimore of a container ship that had some sort of issue that caused the collision with a bridge. But there are thousands of containers on just that single ship, and it's something on the order of 60% of goods move on the oceans. If commercial traffic can't move freely, that immediately affects world economies. And what would we do? Some people don't like that the U.S. can sometimes appear to be the world's police force. That's not really the intent. It's really to help set an example as a leading democracy for how a nation should conduct itself and look out for the interests of other like-minded countries. You'll notice in the Red Sea, other allied nations were brought to bear to show some demonstration of support. Those nations don't all have the same capabilities in terms of ships, but they did show resolve. We saw it similarly in Iraq and Afghanistan, more so in Afghanistan, I think, where allied nations were there with us. They're not there in the same numbers because they don't have the same numbers, but they were making a commitment and a statement to do this together. If we pull back and don't show the same willingness to help and defend them in their time of need, this is problematic.
With other nations, how much do they play a part when it comes to ensuring these straits and the canals have freedom of navigation, or is this predominantly all the U.S. Navy?
Well, presence matters. It takes quantity to demonstrate presence. That has a psychological effect all of its own. When you're talking about inspections and boarding protocols, it doesn't take a particularly fancy combat system on board a ship to execute that. So nations that may have lesser capable ships can still conduct those sort of board and inspect missions. And many of the UN treaties that are enforced, or UN sanctions that are enforced, are done so through that sort of board and inspect kind of philosophy. It's how drugs are found. It's how arms are found, and there's a randomness to it. But those allied nations give us the world order. It gives the world order more numbers of ships to work with. Nobody has the U.S. capability, and it would be a long time catching up. China's making a run at it for sure, but it would take quite some time.
Pivoting to China, can we talk about some of the tactical implications and threats that might exist in the Pacific should there be a conflict there? And then we can lead into some strategic implications as well.
Yes, the Pacific is so much bigger than most people recognize. So just to make some comparative numbers, a typical transit speed for a U.S. ship, it's about 10 days to cross the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. It's about another 3 days to go from Gibraltar to the Suez Canal. It's about 2 days to run down the Red Sea. It's about a day to run around to the Strait of Hormuz. And then it's about 2 days to go up the Persian Gulf. It's about 10 days to go from San Diego to Hawaii, which is still pretty close in the Pacific. To go from one end of Australia to the other is about 10 days of transiting. The Pacific is a very big body of water. And so, we have these other capabilities, strategic bombers that can, fly great distances and spend, short amounts of time over targets and then come back. But, for ships to maneuver, it's a logistics concern just to get to the point of whatever the activity is. So for years now, the U.S. has been building up activity in Guam as part of a reduction of forces in Japan. There were strategic reasons for that and political reasons for that, but that buildup has been ongoing. If there were a China-Taiwan scenario, every war game that's been conducted suggests that the U.S. would take very severe losses. And by that, I mean capital ships on the bottom of the ocean with all the people. There would be loss of aircraft. We would win, but it would be an ugly win. And, is that a fight that we really are prepared to take on? I think it's an open question. The readiness challenges that lurk beneath the surface of the spectacular performance I alluded to at the beginning are very real. We have serious readiness challenges that are born of bad decision making over the course of decades, 20 years of conflict with Iraq and the beating that the rotational forces took, deferred maintenance decisions, slowing of the shipbuilding profile, the contraction of the defense industrial base by as much as 20% in the last 5 years. There are a lot of red lights flashing very brightly that we have some big challenges that we have to resolve. If you superimpose over that our internal political dialogue that is ideologically driven about where should we be, what's important, there's a host of conflicting policies that we just haven't sorted through. And traditionally, those things get forced to a decision by some external force. What will that external force be? I'm not sure. It could be China making an incursion into Taiwan. They're regularly conducting military activity, putting up dozens of aircraft at a time over Taiwan, for example. What is our response? What isn't? What do we not do? We're being watched in how we respond around the world, as I said earlier.
You have vastly more experience than I do when it comes to this next topic, but from my perspective, watching, it seems like we really struggle when it comes to long-range planning. A lot of that is predicated on how our system is created and developed, election cycles, etc. But for example, passing a budget and coming up with a budget. Operating off continuing resolutions limits the ability for a lot of the military to plan, to start new projects, etc., which I think then leads into the, for lack of a better phrase, the knee-jerk reacting to some external force, some external event that forces our hand to put out a new capability to engage in some type of conflict. Is there a way to fix this process? Is that a limiting factor? Am I just off the mark here?
Yeah, how the budget is developed is a problem. We've had this false choice put in front of us between defense spending versus non-defense spending. It started to emerge around 2010 when the concept of sequestration was used as a threat to keep the budget balanced. We had 10 years of sequestration. It never fully took hold because there were a lot of workarounds. But the budget process and the dynamics between the executive branch and the legislative branch have resulted in these various cliffs and deadlines and threats of shutdown as pressure points to try to force consensus and decision making. Before 2010, there was a thing called earmarks in Congress where members of Congress could direct funding to a specific company in their district or to a specific project of interest in their district or their state. And at the time, that dollar value of those earmarks was up to around $3+ billion. And it seemed like a lot of money. And there was the infamous bridge to nowhere that Senator Stevens was funding in Alaska. And that just sort of epitomized some of the folly of what this money was being used for. And so President Obama came to office on the platform in part of doing away with the earmarks and getting a handle on lobbying and the outside influence on the process. Coincidentally, since that time, consensus and the ability to come to agreements has become more difficult because those earmarks were lubricant for the system. Hey, I can get you this locally, but I need you to vote for me or vote with me on this other issue over here. And so the lubricant was taken away from the system, and it's more difficult to get to consensus. It's been well recognized for years that the budget process, it's formally called the planning programming, budgeting, and execution process, PPBE, that needed to be reformed. That came out of post-World War II. It's been with us for 50 years. It came in around the time of Secretary McNamara, who was an automotive executive. He thought, hey, we're not spending money wisely. We need to do it programmatically. Came up with this method that worked in the post-industrial era. It doesn't work in this time of software delivery and much faster technology growth. There was a commission formed to evaluate how can we make this process better. And that commission was formed by Congress and staffed by experts and insiders. And it took them 2 years to come up with about 24 recommendations for improvement. Most of those recommendations are fairly common sense and could be implemented fairly quickly. But it will take Congress to impose those changes because Congress controls the purse and the mechanisms that control the purse. So a long answer to your question, but we didn't just get here. And I say that in my working lifetime, I don't expect dramatic change in how we do budgeting and funding. We could make various relaxations that could make getting to consensus a little easier. The failure to be able to plan for future funding is a number one gripe of industry. You can't have a for-profit company who's accountable to shareholders or to a employee ownership structure. You can't have them make investment plans if they don't know what the commitment is of their singular customer. This single customer, the concept is known as a monopsony, where you only have one buyer out there. So it's not like you can go sell a Columbia-class submarine to somebody else. You can't. There's no other competitive selling opportunity. So you have one buyer, and that's what industry is stuck with. So it is a complex problem, no doubt about it.
I'd like to pivot a little bit. Tomahawk missiles. So you were a subject matter expert during your time in the Navy. Can you talk to me about what a Tomahawk missile is, what its capabilities, basic, and then broad brush tactical and strategic implications of having Tomahawks in the usage?
Yeah, we've had the Tomahawk missile for decades. I recall back in the late 80s, there were people who said, hey, we have a Tomahawk missile that's in search of a target, because people had a hard time imagining what would we ever use this for. And then some of the activities in the Middle East quickly made clear how useful having a standoff weapon like the Tomahawk missile can be. In one of my roles in the Pentagon, I was a chairman's advisor on the Tomahawk weapon system. This was after I had command of a ship. So it's common in the Joint Staff. It's common. It is a fact in the Joint Staff. There are experts of every major weapon system. They're on staff, immediately available for consult when the occasion arises. So I was in the J3 on the Joint Staff and have that sort of exposure to it, but I also have the shipboard exposure. That weapon allows for standoff strike capability where you don't have to put people in harm's way. You can fire from great distances. So a ship in the Eastern Mediterranean can launch into the Persian Gulf area or the Red Sea, and vice versa. You can with the right sort of airspace clearance, you can fly those a long way over other points of land. They can deliver a very precise message, going through a window, so to speak, to be that specific about where it lands. There was a time when the decision point of the decision to launch was hours long, and there was a point of no return where you might give the command to execute, and it would be 6 hours before the launch, but you couldn't turn the launch off, so to speak.
Interesting.
That's now been dialed down to minutes, and we have that ability from the National Security Council down to the shipboard level to communicate, in a highly effective way very quickly. It doesn't make it a tactical weapon, as you would consider maybe a surface-to-air missile or a use of a gun close in, but it has helped with the decision-making of the national security apparatus. We've seen it used successfully multiple times in the Persian Gulf, and we most recently saw it used against some Houthi targets. We used it in Afghanistan against what were effectively tent camps with quality targeting information that's available now with military grade GPS. We can be extremely specific about how they're used. It's not an inexpensive weapon. They cost in the millions of dollars. But again, that trade-off of not putting lives at risk is pretty significant. The other way to get at strike would be from an aircraft carrier, where we have an air wing that has that capability. The U.S. Tends to prefer to do integrated operations where you use some of each, and it's a coordinated activity. That can also be extrapolated to the joint force, where the Air Force is brought into the picture, and those Air Force assets that could come from the United States on a short call, or they could be temporarily forward deployed to another operating base. But that joint configuration is what really came out of the first Gulf War. We really perfected that. So what does Tomahawk get us? It gets us a safe standoff option where there are fewer lives put at risk.
I didn't really think about this aspect because you mentioned it's not really a tactical weapon, because predominantly it's going to be utilized for that strategic strike, first strike with someone doing something bad, and we're not necessarily have a presence in that region or that country, but you can reach out and touch them. But it's coming from the president and at that level for kind of a kickoff versus integrated. And
yeah, it's not a strike package like that is yes, it's approved by the combatant commander, but that's after the overall mission has been approved typically by the president at the the National Security Council level.
Kind of leans into, can you speak to hypersonic missiles at all?
A little bit. We are moving quite quickly with hypersonics. However, we are today limited by our ability to conduct rapid testing of those systems. So Russia and China are both making it crystal clear that they have such capability. We have such capability, but it's not ready for prime time, so to speak. We are not testing at an adequate rate to get it to the place of performance that I think we would expect. There are things that need to happen with range investment and how we manage ranges so that we can speed that process along. We are using some antiquated testing methods, I think, at this point. There's a recognition of this, and there's a movement in the right direction, but we need to do more of it more quickly in order to get these things fielded.
What's holding it back? Why is it taking so long in finding resistance?
Yeah, well, there's always this debate about modernization versus maintenance, and we usually wait too long to shift from one to the other. In a perfect world, we'd be able to do both all the time. And so by modernization, I mean the investment in the new systems, the movement of things from R&D into an operational capability. The maintenance and sustainment, though, is a very real challenge, and it does seem to ebb and flow how well we can keep up with that or not. We are, as I said, just beneath the surface. We have a readiness problem. It's fundamentally a maintenance and sustainment issue. Things like shipyards are backlogged, but it's not limited to ships. It exists across the force. There was a report from the GAO in May of 2023 that made it very clear that all of the services had readiness issues born of parts and materials not being available, supply chain issues, COVID, deferred maintenance, and as I said, backlogs in shipyards. That balance of modernization versus maintenance, it's a challenge. And at the same time, we have this pressure from the top to control what that top line budget is. In FY25, we're talking about $850 billion in a defense budget, that includes all services, to include Space Force, to include certain elements of energy and nuclear. There are a lot of competing pressures on the resourcing process.
Yeah, everything keeps getting more expensive. I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the means, but for an example, the Air Force going through and updating nuclear missiles. That's a big project that I think was estimated at about $100 billion, and right now they're at $130 billion. And one of the issues they're running into is when all these missile fields were created, it was wide open. But now to go rewire and reconnect these silos, you're going through property, commercial structures, et cetera, which is like next to impossible. Just the complications of dealing with the real estate and who owns what, it sends it through the roof. But you run into a maintenance versus, hey, this thing was supposed to be 10 years service life, and now we're going through upgrades that present a lot of unique challenges that, quite frankly, are really hard to overcome.
Yeah, that's generally referred to as encroachment when civilian populations move closer and closer to military activities. If you just look at the population growth in the United States over the time of having a strategic deterrent in place, I mean, we've grown by multiple 100 million people, and they have to go somewhere. They don't all go to the cities. There was a time when some of these the silos from the land forces were in pretty remote areas. And to your point, that might not be the case now, but those strategic systems. So I mentioned Columbia-class submarine, that launches the Delta rocket, the intercontinental ballistic missile. We have this strategic triad of airborne, seaborne, and land-based strategic forces. I think we're in the middle of replenishing. Not. I think we are in the middle of replenishing two of those systems, and they are extremely expensive. With Columbia-class submarine, initially that funding was coming out of the shipbuilding account, and Congress finally recognized that. Hey, if we continued to pay for that just out of the shipbuilding account, we're not going to have any other types of ships which we need. So they came up with a new specialized fund just to support that. I don't think the same type of fund has been created by Congress for the other elements of the nuclear triad, but it may be necessary. Again, these pressures on the budget are very real, and they force decisions to have to be made that any one of which could be argued by the other side or another position. In some ways it's a no-win situation, but we have to do the best we can.
Yeah, it seems you have all these variables and dynamics coming together at a head with years of conflict. The average airframe, if we just talk that specifically, now an F-16. That plane's been around for 50 years. Now, granted, those tails are not 50 years old, but they're 30 years old that the Air Force is flying. The B-52 will be around for 100 years, KC-135. All these things that are just really expensive weapon systems. If we're just talking about the Air Force component, we haven't talked about the Air Force or Navy. You can see that this is a big problem set.
And so, we think those are old. And I'll ask the audience to, if you ever get a chance, step aboard a Coast Guard ship. So I live in Southwest Florida, and I was recently aboard the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Resolute. Fantastic ship. They're doing great things, but it is 59 years old. Oh. The U.S. just sent, or is in the process of sending, a U.S. Coast Guard ship to China to try to be a presence around the Second Thomas Shoal, where there's a debate between the Philippines and China. We're sending a 40-year-old ship to be the single face of the Coast Guard out there. It's not a knock against the Coast Guard by any stretch, because what the crews do with those ships is absolutely amazing, but they are so grossly underfunded. It's embarrassing, and when when you do a cross-service exchange between Navy and Coast Guard, the differences are just stunning in what the capabilities of the ships are and what must be done to keep them running. It's an incredible challenge across DoD, and obviously Coast Guard is part of Homeland Security, but there's never enough money. There's always going to be some wasted money. These priorities do compete. They need to be linked to strategy that makes sense and that people are behind. I think right now, to circle back, we're seeing a disconnect between what we think our strategic place in the world is and what we're willing to pay for and commit to.
Out of curiosity, how long would it take that Coast Guard cutter to make it to the Philippines?
Oh, that is weeks. That is a weeks-long effort for sure. 30 days. There's a little bit of Kentucky windage in that estimate.
Fair enough.
They typically would make some stops along the way just to give the crew a little bit of break. You wouldn't just go 30 days continuously. They could, but that wouldn't be the typical way to do it.
Yeah, that's a long hike. So as we kind of wrap up here, I think it'd be good to kind of broad brush and maybe dig into this a little bit. But how do we balance, short-term needs, tactically, strategically, and then the long-range strategic and diplomatic route? How does this all intertwine? How do we get to a happy either status quo, equilibrium? What does it look like?
So you hit on something there when you use the word diplomatic, in that it's not just the military presence. There's a strategic planning acronym called DIME. Diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic. They all go together. They interrelate, I should say. And it's been a disappointment in my mind to see that in many cases the CIA director is our principal diplomat. I think with the recent activity in Israel, certainly the Secretary of State has been very visible and very active. But he wasn't the first diplomat. It was the CIA director. It's the CIA director that goes to China to reopen the communications after years of zero or poor communication with China. I think that's a problem. The intelligence is always an issue. We touched on was there an intelligence failure when Hamas moved on Israel? I think there was. We don't have the same intelligence assets on a human, from a human intelligence level that we once did. There are reasons for making those changes, and in some cases technology can fill that gap. But then the economic interface, I think, is one where we have multiple points of conflict. We want to bring everything onshore. We want to buy America. We want to, stop offshoring all of the capability that we might have once had in an industrial age. Well, it took us decades to open doors with China and merge our economies in so many ways. It would be extremely difficult to just sever that tie. And it covers all aspects of your life. If you look at your greeting cards that you might still send, if you flip it over, it says "Made in China." If you look at your flatware that you use at your dinner table, flip it over, it says "Made in China." There are so many things in our lives that come from China. The ability to have Amazon deliver something to your door, in part, comes because those products are readily available through resources in China. We rely on rare earth material that in some cases only comes from China. And rare earths are those things that are required in specialized batteries and specialized magnet components. They are such a part of our digital lives that we just take it for granted. So there are many points of policy that conflict with one another across our lives and across agencies of government. So I'm trying to show some examples of diplomatic, intelligence, military, and economic interrelationships that have to be considered. That's where the balance occurs. And right now, I think we're trying to prevent military from becoming too much of the dominant tool, and we need to get back to more diplomacy, more economic management, and maybe a better understanding of the intelligence worldwide.
I like it. That's the piece too. Obviously, it's heavy centric. More talking about, coming from backgrounds with talking about the military action, but ultimately, as you've alluded to, and I've talked about it on the podcast with other guests, the Pacific's a vast distance that creates a large number of problem sets in of itself. Let alone if we talk about just a large scale conflict that could ensue. No one wins there, but being so intertwined economically, using those pressures that are available in the dime model might be a good thing.
Well, they make pretty good political messages. Buy America is a great political message, but it's not practical, and it's not implementable. And Congress repeatedly will create a law that legislates to what I call an end state, a desired end state, but they don't allow for a transition or any other alternative to be developed in the interim, and that creates problems. And I work the Washington arena for defense companies. I help companies achieve dramatic outcomes working in Washington because there's such a high demand for credible evidence to be brought forward on any number of issues. And for every policy, there's a workaround to a policy. For every piece of legislation, there's some rationale to have an exception to legislation. And companies that participate in that process tend to do very well. Those who just lay victim to the big process and apparatus, they struggle and they wonder what just happened.
Well, sir, as we wrap up here, any final thoughts or parting shots before we go away, and then also let people know where they can find you?
Yeah, thanks for that opportunity. I have a website, genemoran.com, where you can find out about my work. I touched on helping defense companies. I've written a lot of books on various parts of this subject that we're talking about, and some of the interrelationships. My focus is on helping companies figure out the funding associated with contracts that will drive outcomes that ultimately support the warfighter. I work in the public policy arena. I teach public policy at Florida State University. I think I have a pretty comprehensive perspective on some of these things that we've talked about. What I see in students that I work with, so young adults coming into the professional world, is they have opinions on how things should be. They question what should be. I think we need to help people make the linkage between what came out of World War II and that world order, and how or why does it still matter today. And I think what some of the near-term resistance that we're seeing right now among the voting population is in some ways a lack of understanding or lack of awareness of what some of these interrelationships are. We don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world order, and we may wish it were another way, but it's not. And so we have to try to live within and shape the world that we're in, and that is done through votes and voting, and we have to have confidence that our voice is being heard, and that and I think we also want to think that voters have adequate information. Since our country's founding, it's been a requirement that to participate requires a certain level of education of the voter, and that's an ongoing challenge to this day.
Absolutely. There's a lot more we can talk about with that. Maybe do a follow-up episode with that, sir. So thank you again for taking the time today. Enjoyed chatting, and it was great to just glean a little bit of your perspective.
Great to be with you, Rain.
Thank you, sir.